Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Wherever you are in the world, we appreciate you being with us right now. This is Lovey Life, a DOM podcast. DOM is a digital and bilingual media company specialized in law at a supranational level. So, for all news, comments, analysis related to law in Africa and in the rest of the world, go to our website dom-online.com and follow us on our social media platforms, the links of which are listed below. This, however, is neither a technical nor a political podcast. To be honest, sometimes it's barely a legal one. The only prerequisite needed is to have an open mind and 30 minutes or so to spare. We sometimes will have guests from everywhere around the world, and we will always be keen to hear your thoughts. We have a fantastic episode for you today, so please stay with us and weigh in while we argue the case, Lovey Life. Life is a fascinating thing. Everything changes, and yet somehow nothing is ever new. I think it is probably because life is more circular than it is linear. And so, in spite of the fact that each generation feels like it is the pinnacle of evolution, it is most likely that the other layer may change, but at the core, the issues, needs, aspirations, and yes, problems are the same. Way to start the episode with platitudes, I know. Let's be a little bit more specific and take an example then. One of the biggest debates of the last 5 to 10 years in the Northern Hemisphere is the gender identity theory. I specify, by the way, Northern Hemisphere, to which I must include Oceania, meaning Australia and New Zealand, because the question is a non-factor in most of the Southern Hemisphere. It is a Northern Hemisphere issue. That's just a fact. Go anywhere in Africa, Central America, Latin America, the Middle East, and a huge part of Asia, or talk to someone from this region and ask them to list their most pressing issues and or grievances. I give you 10 entries and none of them will be gender identity. They will talk about shelter, drought, famine, running water, religious extremism potentially leading to terrorism, education for all, farming issues, access to health sector, fairer justice system, gender roles for sure, the environment, but not gender identity. I'm not just saying so, by the way. I have actually conducted the experiment. Now, the regions I have listed, Africa, Central America, Latin America, the Middle East, Asia, put together amount for 75 to 80% of the global population. It's just a fact that the vast majority of the world is not concerned with the fantastic question of what is a woman. Nonetheless, and whatever one's opinion is on the subject, the gender identity theory is a question that is becoming increasingly important in the Northern Hemisphere, and as such, governments of these countries will most likely than not have to address it, one way or the other. When we boil down the question of gender identity, it comes down to the crucial issue of self-determination, and the question is therefore, to what extent self-determination is an absolute right? Put it that way, I think we can all agree that this is nothing new. One could even say that it is the story of the world. The rise and downfall of all empires and colonial powers that ever existed can be summarized as the clash between two or more factions, trying to dictate or decide the identification or determination of a group of people living on a given territory. We won't go into a history lesson, but suffice to say that one of the biggest movements of the 20th century on the global stage is the decolonization effort, mainly on the African continent. The end result was the creation of a multitude of new independent states and the consolidation of the notion of self-determination as a cornerstone in international law. One of the clearer expressions of that notion can be seen in referendum. The plural of a referendum, by the way, is referenda. It's always very annoying to hear people make that mistake. I'm sorry. In a referendum, people are asked if they want to be part of a given state. In other words, state their allegiance and quite logically tell us how they identify. Again, nothing is ever new. To come back to the decolonization effort in the 20th century, saying that the process was a complete success would be a lie. Many African countries were not satisfied with the frontiers that were drawn, for example. That is never great. Which is worse, in some instances, the self-determination process was not completed, which caused a situation of legal uncertainty that is never desirable. One such example, and the case we will mainly focus on in this episode, is that of Western Sahara and the Sahrawi people. If you take a map of the continent, and there is an interactive one on our website, dome-online.com, obviously, Western Sahara is the territory located in the northwest of Africa. It is bordered by the Atlantic Ocean in the west. In the north, there is Morocco. In the northeast, Algeria. And in the east and the south, there is Mauritania. The story of Western Sahara can be started at any given point in time, obviously. But, due to our time constraint and for the purpose of our theme, which is self-determination, let's start in the second half of the 19th century. By 1860, there are records of Spanish expeditions accosting to the Western Sahara to fish, because if you have looked at the map, or if you know it, remember that the Canary Islands are a Spanish property, and they are not too far away. Over time, the Kingdom of Spain decided to put Western Sahara under its protectorate, because it deemed it terra nulla, meaning a land that does not belong to anyone and on which no one can lay claim. This was made official in the Berlin Conference in 1885. The problem for Spain was that at that time, France was the European occupying power of the region through its presence in Morocco, Mauritania, and Algeria. So, to avoid any stepping on toes, both France and Spain agreed to sign two treaties, respectively in 1900 and 1912, that would define more clearly their respective frontiers. This was the situation from the mid-18th century to the mid-19th century approximately. By the way, have you ever noticed when looking at a map that the frontiers of the African continent look like they have been drawn with a ruler? That is because, oftentimes, they were. The occupying powers over the years have agreed on their respective sphere of influence without thoughts or regards to the people, their identity, culture, way of life, religion, none of that. So, while on the one hand, France and Spain were agreeing on frontiers, albeit from afar, on the other, there was a reality of the situation. Because on the ground, things were quite different. Remember, Sahara may be a desert, but it does not necessarily ensue that it is a no man's land, despite the terra nulla claim made by Spain. Nomad tribes, but also sedentary groups, were living there with their own history, feuds, alliances, allegiances, and the whole lot. Fast forward to around 1950s, and a wind of rebellion was blowing all over Africa. The people across the continent took arms to defend their right to self-determination and kick the colonial powers out. Pardon my French. In this context, the Sahrawi people, native tribe of Western Sahara, waged a war against the Spanish kingdom. They were helped in that endeavor by the newly independent Kingdom of Morocco and the state of Mauritania. Incidentally, Morocco and Mauritania were not natural allies at all. They were at odds with each other. You see, Morocco had the ambition of reconstituting the kingdom in its historic border when it was a sultanate, which included the whole of the Western Sahara, but also a portion of Mauritania. So, as a result, Morocco at that time did not recognize Mauritania as a newly created independent state, at least in that form and with those borders. But it is amazing how a common enemy can act as a bonding agent. So, Morocco, Mauritania, and the Sahrawi people of Western Sahara put aside their personal agendas in order to get rid of the Spanish presence, had different phases and lasted almost 20 years, from 1956 to 1975. And finally, on November 14, 1975, Spain, Mauritania, and Morocco signed the Madrid Agreements, where the Spanish government relinquished its pretension over Western Sahara and divided it between Mauritania and Morocco. You notice I said Mauritania and Morocco. The Sahrawi people were neither invited nor consulted. Their identity and right to self-determination was once again ignored. As they were not prepared to go from one ruler to another, the main faction of resistance of the Sahrawi people, called Front Polisario, Polisario Front, unilaterally proclaimed the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic on February 27, 1976, and once again took arms, but this time against both Morocco and Mauritania. If you pay attention to international relations, you will notice that very few bonds stand the test of time. And in fact, one can be sure of one's enemies, more so than one's allies. So war it was, and with arms and tactical training supplied by outside forces, mainly Algeria, let's be honest, the Polisario Front was able to inflict real damage, so much so that in 1979, Mauritania laid down its weapons. In the peace treaty signed in 1979, the new Mauritanian government recognized Sahrawi rights to Western Sahara and relinquished its own claims. Mauritania also formally recognized the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, causing a massive rupture in relations with Morocco. The area evacuated by Mauritania was instantly annexed by Morocco. But the math was pretty simple. 2 down and 1 less to go. That was the mindset of both warring parties, actually. From the mid-1980s, Morocco largely managed to keep the Polisario troops off by building a wall known as the Moroccan Wall. Where have we heard that before? I told you, very few things are new. From China to the US to Morocco, there's only one constant. Men. And we all think alike, however much we want to believe otherwise. The wall stalemated the war, with no side able to achieve decisive gain. So, both parties negotiated, and a ceasefire was put in place in September 1991 under the condition of a referendum being organized. We are in 2023, and said referendum has yet to happen, because no one can agree on the electoral lists, as Morocco rejected several proposals because, as it stated, it would be to the advantage of the independence of Western Sahara. And there is no resolution in sight. So the question is, how long can one wait? I guess we'll have to find out, because 30 years after the ceasefires, tensions resumed in 2021. But, luckily, it did not lead to an all-out war. So, now that we have summarized the position, let's look at the legal conflict that was happening at the same time as the events we've just described. To be fair, we have talked about law already, though admittedly not in details. But we said that Spain put Western Sahara under its protectorate, that treaties were signed with various states over the century it spent there, until 1975, where Spain left. This is international law. The first major legal international act with regard to self-determination of Western Sahara was in 1963. So remember, at that time, Spain was still a colonial power, but it was battling the Sahrawi people, Mauritania, and Morocco. And it was Morocco which petitioned the United Nations to register Western Sahara on the UN list for non-autonomous territory. At that time, Morocco thought that once Spain had left, the Western Sahara would naturally become part of its southern provinces, as the kingdom believed it was once. A terrible miscalculation if there ever was one. But hindsight is always 20/20. Nevertheless, the territory was listed on the UN non-autonomous territory, where it remains to this day. The second big international legal act happened in 1975. If you remember, it was right around the time where Spain was about to relinquish all claims to Western Sahara. At that time, the General Assembly of the United Nations asked the International Court of Justice to give an advisory opinion on two questions. The first one being, was the territory of Western Sahara a terra nulla when the Kingdom of Spain declared it under its protectorate? And the second one is, what were, if any, the legal relationships between Western Sahara and the Kingdom of Morocco and the Mauritanian ensemble? With regard to the first question, meaning the legal status of Western Sahara at the time of the Spanish colonization, the International Court of Justice ruled that Western Sahara could not have been a terra nulla, given that by Spain's own admission, the kingdom had to sign agreements with the chiefs of the local tribes, nomads and sedentary, to be able to establish its presence in the 19th century. Morocco challenged the legality of these agreements, but this was not in the purview of the court, which noted that, legal or not, these agreements informed us on the mindset of the Spanish power when it first arrived in Western Sahara. They knew that it was not a no man's land, and they tried to secure allegiance of the nomad tribes and the Sahrawi people at large by entering into these agreements. So, in fact and in law, Spain actually occupied that territory. With regard to the second question, meaning the exact legal relationships between the territory of Western Sahara, Morocco and Mauritania, the court concluded that, per the information brought to its attention, there was, at the time of the Spanish colonization, legal links of allegiance between the Sultanate of Morocco, as it was at the time, and some of the tribes living in the territory of Western Sahara. The information also shows the existence of rights, including certain rights to the land, that constituted links between the Mauritanian entity, as the court now understood it, and the territory of Western Sahara. On the other hand, the court concluded that the information brought to its attention did not establish the existence of any link of territorial sovereignty between the territory of Western Sahara on the one hand, the Kingdom of Morocco, or the Mauritanian entity, for that matter, on the other hand. Therefore, the court has not found that there is a previous link that would alter the decolonization process of the Western Sahara. In short, if I have lost you, according to this advisory opinion issued in 1975 by the International Court of Justice, the Sahrawi people had every right to apply the principle of self-determination through the free and genuine expression of the will of the people of the territory. The problem, of course, is that it was an advisory opinion. Therefore, it's not binding, and both Morocco and Mauritania refused to follow the conclusion laid out by the court. Hence, the ensuing war that we've talked about. As we previously stated, Mauritania was defeated on the battlefield, but Morocco continues to treat Western Sahara as part of its southern provinces and refused to recognize the Sahrawi government. We've talked about this. One thing we have not clearly stated though, and perhaps it is because it is rather obvious when trying to get through our topical question of is anything ever new, is that self-identification or self-determination is actually a two-step process. The first one is certainly that one person or a group of persons get to tell the rest of the world who they are and how they want to be perceived. The second part is the problem because you need the validation or recognition of everyone else, however you slice it. It is rather ironic, I know, but it is factual. For self-identification to hold social currency or legal value, everyone else has to agree to take this information on board. Otherwise, you get conflict. To take the first example we talked about, the whole gender identity theory. That is why it is so fiercely debated in the Northern Hemisphere, is it not, when you think about it? If the issue was just a case of people identifying as a different gender, the matter would not be so hotly contested. It becomes a hot-button issue because it's not enough for members of this community to state the fact. They need, in order to operate in society, to have their position legally recognized and socially validated. The process is the same for every minority, every difference, every group. It's the same. It's not towards the people of that community. It's just the way life works. So when you boil things down, this is what is at the heart of, for example, the trans policies in sports or more inclusive and gender-neutral language. So, a significant part of self-identification rests on the acceptance of everyone else. Make of that what you will. Now, take what we have just said at the micro level, meaning at the individual level, and transfer it at the macro level, meaning the state level. So, the international legal parallel is quite obvious. First step is the declaration of independence by a newly created state. And second, the recognition by the quote-unquote international community of this newly created independent country. Affirming that you are an independent state is good and well, but it will not get you far without the express consent of not only the majority of the other countries, but certainly the support of the superpowers. The United States, Russia, yes, I know, but it's a fact. China, France, the United Kingdom. If you don't believe me, ask Palestine, or Hong Kong, for that matter. But let's come back to the Sahrawi Republic. Let's shine a little bit of light on them. As we have stated, they declared their independence on February 27, 1976. That is almost 50 years ago. The first part of the self-identification process was completed. The problem is that the second part of the self-identification process has never been achieved, and it is not, at least not entirely, Morocco's fault. You see, had the Sahrawi people garnered more support at the international or even regional level, Morocco would be in a more difficult position on the international stage. The UN is not applying any pressure to get this referendum going. We just have to be honest here. They issue an annual recommendation every year since 2008, urging parties to cooperate. Yet, the stalemate continues, and recent developments on the international stage have directed the focus and resources of the UN elsewhere. Let's look at the Arab League. Well, the Arab League aligns its position with that of the Kingdom of Morocco. And, in the Maghreb region, only Algeria recognizes the Polisario Front as a functioning government. A cynical mind could point out that it has less to do with the actual Sahrawi people and more to do with the diplomatic battle for the supremacy of the region between Algeria and Morocco. But lawyers are usually jaded people, so don't take my word for it. There is one last regional ensemble we have not mentioned, and we would be remiss not to do so. It is the African Union. Morocco was a founding member of the Organization of the African Union back in 1963. However, the Sahrawi Republic was accepted as a member state of the organization in 1982. As a sign of protest, Morocco left the African Union in 1984. but the kingdom wished to rejoin the Union in 2017. This, you see, creates a bit of a legal conundrum because the Charter of the African Union states that one of its main goals is to defend the sovereignty, the territorial integrity, and independence of its member states. And, however you look at it, it cannot do so for both these countries at the same time. How to reconcile the stated objectives of the Charter, meaning the right to self-determination or self-identification, with the current predicament of Sahrawi Republic and the Kingdom of Morocco. That was essentially the question that was asked to the African Court of Human and People's Rights, which is the judicial arm of the African Union. The case was heard in September 2022, and essentially, let's just be honest, the court did not issue a ruling on substance. It reaffirmed the right of people to achieve independence from colonization, but sent the issue back to the Conference of States. Okay, I'm being a bit harsh here, because the case was set up in a weird way. It was a Ghanaian citizen suing 8 countries, none of them being Morocco, because of a legal technicality. Very, very peculiar. If you are interested in the case, and it is a good one, I promise, it is obviously available on our website with the summary to boot. To conclude, and as a general rule, same issues usually have same solutions. Open wars, social unrest, time, peer pressure, good marketing, strategic alliance, negotiation. Not necessarily in that order, by the way. I don't mean to trivialize it because self-identification is really about the ability of one person or a group of persons to experience life in its fullest form. And we should wish that for everyone. Unfortunately, it's not always so. And when we are confronted with what we feel is a novel issue, as creative minds, we tend to try and innovate, which is fantastic. That is the backbone of evolution and the reason why we're still here as a group. But we also have to be willing to go through history and find the situation that most resemble our current predicament. Chances are someone, somewhere over time has come up with a blueprint to fix it. Thank you so much for being with us today. I want to hear what you have to say. Do you have any comments, questions? Does it make sense or does it not? Leave a comment below the link of the episode on our social media platforms using the hashtag #LovieLife. The transcript of the program will be available on Dome's website in both French and English. If you have enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing, liking it, and subscribing to the show. We have had some great episodes previously, and we would be very grateful if you would consider listening to them. We will be back with our next episode next Wednesday. In the meantime, please stay safe and take care of yourself.